Hi everyone, my name is Patrick Rudder, and I'll be presenting on biased journalism in Laos during the Cold War. Cold War was a turbulent time for most nations across the world. Whether they were being torn apart due to the competing influence of the United States and the Soviet Union, or were dealing with their newfound independence from imperial powers, many nations had to find new ways to survive these possible hazards. Some threw their lot in with either superpower, some played the two superpowers off of each other, and some others still ignored both superpowers and went about with their normal business the best they could. Laos was, in theory, one of the ones that stayed neutral during the Cold War. The reality of the Laos situation during the Second Indochina War, however, tells a different story. It tells the story of a nation slowly falling apart due to internal strife and external meddling. It tells the story of a new nation struggling to build a functioning state from the ashes of colonialism and the threat of internal dissent. Using the Lao Press, a French-language Royal Lao government newspaper, we can see what the government thought important to tell their citizens during a time of crisis, the year 1965. The Lao Press, knowingly or unknowingly, presented an anti-communist bias in their reporting from April 17, 1965 to October 28, 1965. By analyzing what the Lao Press decided to focus on in the news and what they chose to omit from their reporting, one can see the subtle bias. The historiography for the history of the Royal Lao government is rather scant. Research on the RLG is hampered by a lack of primary sources from the government. The communist government, who came into power in 1975, destroyed many of the papers from the Royal Lao government. This forced many histories of the Royal Lao government to rely on outside sources, which would naturally focus on the actions of outsiders such as the United States and France. Recently, however, there has been an increase in reevaluating the role of the RLG in the Second Indochina War. In translating parts of the Lao Press, I hope to continue exploring the role of the Royal Lao government and, by extension, the people of Laos in the Second Indochina War. The Lao Press was a French-language government newspaper that consisted of the News of Laos, Diverse Communications, and the News of the World. The News of Laos mainly covered news specifically relating to the nation of Laos. Diverse Communications mainly consisted of government bulletins and other advertisements. And the News of the World was about global issues, mainly focused on Asia. For my translating, I would mainly focus on the News of Laos and News of the World, looking for articles relating to the Vietnam War and Pathet Lao movements in the nation. Once I found an interesting sounding article, I would translate it from French to English and go over my findings with my mentors. This here is an example of an article I translated. It's about violations of the ceasefire accords committed by the Pathet Lao forces. It goes to over there. Ever since the late 19th century, the territory that is now Laos was part of French Indochina along with modern-day Cambodia and Vietnam. There's Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. It's part of French Indochina. There it is in the 60s. Under French rule, Laos was flooded with Vietnamese people taking government positions, leading to much resentment among the Lao populace. Many Lao elites were educated in French colonial schools in Vietnam, Cambodia, Algeria, and even France itself. This education abroad led many Lao elites to adopt the ideas popularized by the French Revolution: liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. This foreign education, paired with events going on in neighboring Thailand, led to the growth of a native democracy. Even under French rule, there was resistance slowly growing. The Japanese invasion of French Indochina in the 1940s led to the collapse of French rule in Laos temporarily. The Japanese invasion led to the king declaring independence from France in 1945. In the chaos, a freedom organization called the Lao Isara emerged to attempt to create an independent state. This independent state took the form of a liberal democracy under King Sisavang Vong. In 1946, the French returned and offered limited autonomy to Laos. In neighboring Vietnam, the Viet Minh began making attempts to export the communist revolution to Laos, eventually leading to the formation of the Pathet Lao in 1950 with Prince Suphanavong as their leader. From 1946 to 1954, 1954, France fought a war against the Viet Minh to restore French colonial control of Indochina. A couple of battles took place in Laos where the advancing North Vietnamese forces gave the Pathet Lao a base to work from. In October of 1953, France granted independence to the Royal Lao government in the midst of the First Indochina War. The First Indochina War ended at the Geneva Conference of 1954, which stated that Laos was to remain militarily isolated from the rest of the world unless in danger. Fighting sparked back up between the Royal Lao government and the Pathet Lao in 1959, following the elections of 1958. This civil war would last until 1975 and have large effects on the neighboring conflict in Vietnam. In 1962, there was a second Geneva Accords, which attempted to make Laos a true neutral nation. This led to the formation of another coalition government, which quickly fell too. Over time, Prince Suvana began to turn away from cooperation with the Pathet Lao towards a more antagonistic view, culminating in the decision to have the United States begin bombing Pathet Lao forces on May 21st, 1964. Lao politics mainly consisted of three factions. The neutralist faction, led by Prince Suvana, he's the one in the middle there. The Pathet Lao, led by Prince Supanavong, which he's the one on the left there. And the rightists, led by Prince Boom Un, he's the one on the right. The neutralist goal was for the three groups to participate in fair and free elections together. The Pathet Lao, on the other hand, wanted a communist revolution, while the rightists were staunch anti-communists and refused their participation in any government. Over time, the neutralist position began to slowly slide away from advocating for cooperation with the Pathet Lao, more towards hostility and antagonism towards them. You can see the slow transition in how they treat the Pathet Lao and other communist groups in the Lao Press by 1965. The Lao Press, knowingly or unknowingly, presented an anti-communist bias in their reporting from April 17, 1965 to October 28, 1965. At this time in the Second Indochina War, the U.S. bombing campaign over Laos had been going on for just shy of a year, and U.S. troops were flooding into Vietnam to help Saigon. It was a delicate time, especially for an embattled Royal Lao government fighting off the Pathet Lao and their Vietnamese backers. 1962, all relevant powers in Indochina, the United States, Soviet Union, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and China, all signed the 1962 Geneva Accords. The accords stated that Laos was to remain neutral and that none of the signing parties could send troops to it. Almost none of the parties that signed these accords adhered to them. Starting in 1961, the CIA would begin to train and arm Lao anti-communists. The CIA didn't stop this after 1962, however, breaking the Geneva Accords. According to the Lao Press, however, only the communist forces were breaking the Geneva Accords. In late October, the paper published 2 articles about how the Pathet Lao were violating the ceasefire agreements by attacking the National Armed Forces. This here's one of said articles, detailing dates and times when they were attacked. The Lao Press also, when covering the Vietnam War, worded their articles in such a way as to make the South Vietnamese and Americans as the protagonists. Much of the information about the ongoing Vietnam War comes from American perspectives, such as American generals, admirals, and politicians. That may be because their source for global news, the Agence France Presse, is based in France, but considering how the communists were theoretically part of the government, they should have tried to incorporate the North Vietnamese view into the paper as well. Interestingly, there is no mention of any United States bombing over Laos during the 6-month window being looked at. The bombing didn't stop, it went on ahead, albeit much more limited scale than later in the war. This glaring omission from the news is quite interesting, pointing towards a government cover-up. The Royal Lao government, now firmly against the Pathet Lao, want to invoke the Geneva Accords against the communists, but also want to reap the benefits of United States air power, leading to the suppression of the bombing campaign in both the United States and Laos. This suppression runs against the Royal Lao government's previous stance that the Pathet Lao should be included in the government, signaling the complete collapse of the ideas of coalition government and reconciliation. On On February 21st, 1973, after over a decade of fighting and widespread American bombing campaigns, the Pathet Lao finally rejoined the Royal Lao government with the signing of the Vientiane Agreements. These agreements didn't last long, as the Pathet Lao, emboldened by recent communist victories in neighboring Saigon and Cambodia, eventually took full control of the government. Despite their best efforts, the Royal Lao government fell on December 2nd, 1975, when the communists abolished the monarchy, dissolved the new coalition government, and proclaimed the Lao People's Democratic Republic. From the onset, the RLG was fighting a losing battle, since the Pathet Lao had the support of their neighbor, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. With the withdrawal of U.S. support in 1973, the writing was on the wall. The fall of Saigon was the nail in the coffin of any real anti-communist action in Indochina. Through the lens of the Lao Press, one can see the slow shift in the attitude of the Royal Lao government towards the Pathet Lao. They went from desiring cooperation to working with them, to covering up American bombing raids on their own people to combat the growing communist threat to their government. The Lao Press also shows that media bias isn't just outright lying and bashing the opponent. The media can use more subtle forms of bias, such as choosing what to include in the paper and what not to include, whose viewpoint to use, and even by focusing on just the foreign policy of a specific superpower.
Patrick will take any questions you might have.
Why was Laos so important to all these countries?
It was important to North Vietnam because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a crucial supply network for the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. That's also why it was important to the Americans. And there's also the domino effect theory, which means if one country in Indochina falls, they're all going to fall to communism. And the U.S. doesn't want that. So first it'll be Vietnam, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, and India. Although we know that didn't actually happen, but
Thank you.
What type of challenges did you come across during your research?
Occasionally I'd run into an article that just didn't have very good print quality and I couldn't read it. And then there was some, they have a little bit different French than what I was taught, so I had to adjust to that. New words that I didn't learn. Don't learn much about war in French class. Maybe second year French, I don't know. But,
You spoke of the three princes. Did they each have an equal impact on that whole series of events, or was one more influential than the others?
I think that the Prince Boom, he was kind of just a figurehead of the rightist movement, but Prince Suvana, he was the prime minister of the Royal Lao government. And Prince Suphavong, he was kind of a figurehead, but he was politically active in the Pathet Lao.
Any other questions?
So in the paper, you were talking about the bias of the newspapers. Do you have any other source to compare? I mean, in order to argue that this article is biased, you have to compare with other sources, right? So that you can know it's biased. Do you have any other references you use?
I didn't have any newspapers or other newspapers, but I did have secondary sources that talked about what was going on at the time and that sort of thing. So I mean, I think this is the only French language newspaper.
Thank you.
Thank you all.